Good afternoon. This is Professor Amina Al-Din with Muslim Network TV hosting Critical Talk. Today, I thought I would explore Muslims in China and China in general because we talk a lot about China, we talk a lot about the Uyghur, we don't talk about mainland Chinese the way. And I called on an old buddy of mine, Professor Dru Gladney, who is chair and professor of anthropology at Pomona College in Claremont, California, where it's warm and I'm jealous, and recent president of the Pacific Basin Institute. He is the author of the award winning book, Muslim Chinese Ethnic Nationalism in the People's Republic, which I recommend to everybody, as well as Ethnic Identity in China, the making of a Muslim minority nationality, which we're also going to talk about, and making majorities, constituting the nation in Japan, China, Korea, Malaysia, Fiji, Turkey, and the US, all of which are almost warm, and dislocating China, Muslim minorities, and other alternate subjects. Welcome to Critical Talk, Professor Dru Gladney.
Hello, Amina. So nice to see you again. It's been
It,
much too long.
and you got on a shirt that lets me know it's a hell of a lot warmer there than it is in Chicago. Thank you
Mashallah,
so much.
mashallah.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I want to open your talk, Connor, if you will, with the call to prayer. I guess it'll get here eventually. Connor, the call to prayer. He's telling me something. Okay, I'm being told that the video is not working at the moment. Maybe it will work later. But let's start off with my audiences are probably, other than the term, unfamiliar with the Muslim Chinese and the ethnic groups in China. So you want to start off with telling us a little bit about how ethnic groups are arranged in China and which ones are Muslim.
Well, thank you for that question and for your interest in this subject. I think the news we've been having lately about China in general, but particularly about the Muslims in China known as the Uyghur, have been pretty alarming and pretty negative. So I'm really glad, Amina, to have this chance to chat with you at length about the kind of background to the situation that is so difficult, so challenging for the Uyghur. It's also challenging for the majority of the Muslims in China. There's been a sort of general crackdown on any religious activity, not just Islamic and Muslims, but also Tibetan Buddhists, of course, but also Christians and Catholics. And the government has swung much more conservatively. And this affects all believers in China, not just the Muslims, but especially the Muslims. So to put it in context, there are about 24 million Muslims in China. Sometimes you hear these wild, larger numbers, but
Yeah.
one thing I've learned about the Chinese living and working there for over 30 years is they're very good at counting things. So if there were a lot more or a lot less, I think they'd find that out. And actually, the China's become a real surveillance state, so they have so much information on everybody. It's really scary.
Yeah.
And some people think they tested their capabilities of surveillance on the
Mm.
Uyghur because the Uyghurs are now known for being one of the more restive and resistant Muslim groups to Chinese rule. but they're the second largest group. There's, like I mentioned, 24 million Muslims in China. Roughly 11 million is the majority of a community known as the Hui, spelled Hui. And when you say Chinese Muslims, that's generally the group people have in mind because
Mhm.
they speak Chinese, they look Chinese, they live all over China.
Okay.
They're the largest groups in terms of population and the most spread out. And the most people would say acculturated into Chinese language and culture and practice. I don't like to use the word assimilated because they're not. Many of them are very, very distinct, not only in their religious belief, but also in their culture, in their food, and their practice, and things like that. The
Well,
second largest group, yeah, go
where
ahead,
do they
please.
come from that there would be a difference?
Well, the Hui are probably the longest, their ancestors were in China at the earliest period, even perhaps before the Hijra of Muhammad the Prophet. We know there were Arab and Persian traders in China in the 5th century. We have
Right.
records of that. And we
Mhm.
have very early mosques on the southeast coast of China. So we know there were these Middle Eastern traders. And in Islam, as Islam spread across the Levant into Central Asia, along the spice routes through Southeast Asia, it
Mhm.
came to China very, very early because of the high level of trade between the Chinese Tang dynasty and the empires of the Middle East, the Umayyad, the Abbasids, etc. So when these Muslim traders were coming in and out of China, many of them began to settle. And they are the earliest ancestors of the people today we call the Hui. Now, why are they called Hui? There's a lot of theories about that, no really good ones. It probably comes from an earlier rendition of the people today known as the Uyghur, because they were just called the Huihe in early Chinese documents. The Chinese didn't know who these people were. They were very strange, worshiped one god, didn't eat pork, lived in small communities. And they settled all over the ancient Silk Road capitals, in the ports along the southeast coast. I've done a lot of work in the southeast coast, a city that Ibn Battuta visited and called Zaytun. And nobody knew what he visited. Where was this place, Zaytun? Well, as you know, Amina, Zaytun in Arabic means olive, and in Turkish too. And so
Mhm.
that was a great olive trading port for Ibn Battuta to visit. And today it's known as Tranjo. And Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo visited the city, said it was the largest city and port in the world. And those two guys would have known at the time. So these Muslims were all over China. They settled. A lot of them took on Chinese wives and raised their children as Muslims. And from these earliest ancestors, both Arabs, Persians, Turkic peoples in Central Asia, and even a large contingent of Mongols who converted to Islam and
Right.
settled in China. Right. Those are the early ancestors of the people today called the Hui.
Wow.
Wow.
Let us, they tell me that the video is ready. Let us play it.
This man is Imam Mahi Hui.
Wow. He's even got the right name.
A dear
Play.
friend.
I don't know what's happening. They tell me they have it and it's still not playing. Let's continue. I'm trying to get a map of China up and because I think it's important to now tell me if I'm wrong because I read your book 3 or 4 times because I
Thank
used
you.
it in class. No, it's not a thank you. It's a thank you from me. And I'm getting that the Uyghur live west,
Yes.
which leads me to think that because they don't look so Chinese, that perhaps they have a Mongolian ancestry? No, yes.
More Turkic. It looks like we've got a map here.
Or
So if you
North.
look on the map, about where the word China is, interestingly enough, in the center of the map. That's where the Uyghurs live.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. So it is west. Okay.
yeah, it is west. The Hui, like I mentioned, are spread out all over China.
Okay.
The Hui in the far northwest region, the Uyghurs refer to that region as Eastern Turkestan, where they live mostly.
Okay.
About 95% of the 10 million Uyghurs are concentrated in that region, whereas the vast majority of Hui are spread out all over China, about the 11 million Hui. And then we have 8 other ethnic Muslim communities that are recognized by the government.
Tell me
Like the
about.
Uyghur, yeah, they all have their own languages. You may have heard of Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. They
Mm.
all live in China as well. And because
Oh.
China had a very close relation with the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, a lot of those stands and republics of the Soviet Union have peoples also in China that have the same language and were recognized by the early Chinese communists.
Mm.
There's 3 groups that are unique to China. They're known as the Dongshang, the
Mhm.
Baoan, and the Salar. Now, they all speak Turkic, Mongolian, and mixed with Chinese languages. It's only the Hui that speak Chinese all over China. They speak Cantonese in the south, they speak
Mhm.
Mandarin in the north. The Uyghur, I think, are the ones that are the most important for our discussion today because they're in the news the most. They're the second largest, and they're
Mm.
pretty much all concentrated in one territory known as Eastern Turkestan. The Chinese government calls the region Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region. And Xinjiang in Chinese means new territory, new region, which suggests a colonial history, and indeed it is. That name was established under the Chinese when they basically colonized the region in the mid 18th century. Until that time, the Uyghurs had lived there. They had various levels of autonomy. They had 2 independent governments that were recognized internationally as
Oh.
the Eastern Turkestani republics. So they'd been recognized internationally. But when China ended its civil war with the nationalists and fought originally with the Japanese, World War II, then they took control of that region basically until now. So really, it's from the 1950s until now that China has had really secure control over that region, like Tibet, very much like Tibet in
Does that
terms of
mean that it's not autonomous anymore?
it's autonomous legally, but some people say in name only. So, for
Uh,
example, Tibet is an autonomous region as well. Now, how much autonomy do they actually have? Eh, it's it's a legal term. It's useful in some degree. The Uyghurs have some kinds of benefits like the Tibetans in terms of getting into college and getting tax reduction and exemption from certain things. But most of us who study these regions feel like the autonomous regions may have actually less freedom than the informal regions where Muslims live all over China, like places like Qinghai and Xi'an. If we get to ever see this video of Imam Ma Liangji in the call to prayer, he's in Xi'an, which is a very vibrant Muslim city, the former capital of China known as Chang'an. Huge Muslim population, beautiful mosques,
okay,
and Islam is thriving in that city.
let's take a break because I really want to see this video now and give my producers a moment to get it up. This is Professor Amina Dean, and I'm talking with Professor Dru Gladney about what is going on with Muslims in China. I couldn't have a better expert, so please stay tuned. We'll be right back. Professor Gladney, welcome to Critical Talk. This is Professor Amina Aldine. It seems like we have a conflict of interest between the format of the video and the platform we're using. So hopefully, when I ask you to come back, we can do this more culturally. And I'll work that out with you as to how we, because it is so important for our audience and me to see what's going on. But I want to go back to we have Hui Muslims living everywhere. And apparently they live in small communities or large communities or whatever, and speak Chinese. Then we have, as you're saying, because I'm taking notes, I'm a good student. We have these Turkic communities, the stands, I call them, because I can't ever keep them straight. And then we have Mongolia sitting right north of China, and Russia spreading its wings. So, who do the Uyghur identify with? Do they speak Chinese? Number one.
Well, they learn it in school.
Okay.
And until recently, China was very strong in terms of its encouragement of bilingual education, and they encouraged the preservation of minority languages, whether it was Tibetan or Uyghur. But in recent years, they've been restricting that more and more, and literally forcing minorities to learn Mandarin across the country. But for the most part, they've had a very good bilingual education, materials, radios, television programs, all in Uyghur. Uyghur is a Turkic language. Turkic languages throughout Central Asia, from Mongolia all the way to Turkey and Istanbul, about a 70% overlap. So they can generally understand each other at a rudimentary level, but then they use different scripts. So in China, they've revived a modified Arabic script to write the Turkic language of Uyghur, which has a very ancient history. The Uyghurs converted to Islam from about the 9th century on into the 15th century. And
Oh,
from about the 6th, 7th, 8th century, they had their own kingdom, which extended from what is now Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, Karabakh, all the way into what is now under Chinese rule as Xinjiang. And those were all Uyghur oases and trading centers where the Uyghur helped introduce Buddhism to China. They were Buddhist, they were Zoroastrian, they were Manichaean, and they basically were cultural entrepreneurs and mediators that helped bring a lot of these Silk Road riches, spices, and ideas like Buddhism into China. Later, as Islam spread along the Silk Roads, Uyghurs gradually converted to Islam.
no.
So they're one of many Turkic-speaking Muslim communities in Central Asia, like the Kazakhs, like the Uzbeks. In fact, Uyghur and Uzbek, in terms of language, is very, very close. And they can understand each other easily, except Uzbek is written in a Cyrillic, Russian invented script, Russian-based script. And Uyghur now in China is written in an Arabicized script, whereas Turkish, as we know in Turkey, is with a Roman script, like our
Well,
alphabet.
that's just wonderful. But
Some
do
people think it was deliberate, that a divide and rule strategy to under the Russians to keep these Turkic peoples from uniting together, to divide them along linguistic lines. And it's worked. It's worked.
so it's using language and the alphabet as a tool, a strategic tool to keep them from getting together. Well, has Turkey ever made a claim on the Uyghur and
Well, many Turks believe that the Uyghurs are their ancestors.
oh,
And Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, actually promoted that idea. But
mm,
under the Soviet Union, they were very afraid of this pan-Turkism and pan-Turanianism. And so they
mm,
worked very hard to break all that up and to divide the Central Asian republics against each other. This divide and rule strategy was also followed in China. So they divided the Muslims into 10 separate nationalities.
Oh
each
my
with their own language, each with
God.
their own sort of organization. And they've always been worried about pan Islam, pan Turkism. So this is something that government, particularly communist governments, have feared tremendously. And I think it's this Islamophobia that we see rampant today in China in its treatment of the Uyghurs.
Wow. I'm remembering where you talk a little bit about all these nationalities, and I'm encouraging again, if you want to get a book that will give you a foundation, it is Dr. Gladney's The Muslim Chinese. It is really quite foundational. And I remember reading in there about the young man who stood in front of the tanks. I remember all this stuff. See? So you want to talk about it just for a minute.
Yeah. Well, what's amazing that you're referring to the Tiananmen uprising that
Right.
happened in Beijing and Tiananmen Square, and the students were engaged with that, and my students, my
Right.
Muslim students, helped
Wow.
lead the way. Many people don't know that this student protest in Beijing was a democratic protest. In other words, they elected their own student leaders and they organized on the campuses around Beijing, especially Peking University, Tsinghua, and other famous campuses. Well, the elected leader of the entire student protest of Tiananmen was a Uyghur, was a Uyghur,
Yeah.
and he helped lead the students into the square, and a lot of minority students uh, supported this democracy movement, and they were very organized, and of course they were crushed by those tanks and by the PLA soldiers. And that one incident that you referred to, where the tanks were literally stopped by a young man who was fearless. Now the Chinese show that film and they say, "See, we didn't kill anybody. We showed restraint. Those tanks could have run this kid over, but they
Right.
stopped." Well, people see the same thing differently, and most people recognize that the guy took great risk, personal risk, and was fed up. And he has disappeared. We really don't know whatever happened to that man, and we're, of course, afraid for
Yes,
the worst.
I can guess. You know,
Yeah.
but the capturing of that picture and knowing who he was is extremely important. In history. Um, I
Well,
want to.
it's an illustration of Chinese rule. They don't want to lose their
Yeah.
grip.
I want to take another quick break and I want to come back and talk a little bit more on what's actually happening in China today. I can kind of see an effort by a government who has it made a bunch of nationalities trying to keep one thing at bay, but in doing that, it's created serious problems for itself. So let us take another quick break and we'll be right back, and that's where we'll start. This is Professor Amanal Dean with Professor Dru Gladney, and we're talking about what's happening in China. We'll be right back. Hello, this is Critical Talk with Professor Amanal Dean and Professor Dru Gladney from Forum Muslim Network TV. And I was asking you, and you're such an extraordinary teacher. That we're going to have to do this in two parts because now I want to know more. you know, um, what is going on? I mean, there are all these nationalities I learned from your book, and it seems like they served a purpose for a moment. Now that it seems, and this is, student me looking at it, that the Chinese feel an impetus to have one nation, so to speak, and to force people some way or the other through detention camps, re-education camps, to you got to be Chinese. What? Tell me, where am I wrong?
I think you've summed it up rather well, actually. We've seen the trend in China now to a much more monocultural,
Mhm.
some people call it Maoist view of the country.
Right.
China is going global. Its economy, it's doing better now this month than it was last year this time, despite
Okay.
COVID.
Okay.
So they have managed COVID much better than us. They're certainly responsible for getting out of China, but they've somehow managed to uh, live with it and control it, and they are back in business. And Xi Jinping, the current premier of China, has his Belt and Road Initiative, which is spreading out from China across Europe into Central Asia through Europe into the Middle East to secure energy resources, which China lacks, and also build trade relationships with the Middle East, and into North Africa and Africa. And really, it's a global effort through Southeast Asia. And this is Xi Jinping's signature legacy.
I
And it's making China reach out beyond its borders.
Mhm.
And of course, Xinjiang, the region where the Uyghurs are, is right at the crossroads,
I see.
crosshairs, some people call it, of
Mhm.
this grand strategy, this grand plan. So they need to rein them in. They need to make sure that they're going to have no speed bumps on the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Uyghurs are right in the way. And so the government, we think, is trying its hardest to crack down on any incidents of resistance or protest. They also are deathly afraid of radical Islam. It's a communist government. They don't really encourage any kind of religious activity,
Right.
and they monitor it very closely. They restrict it, but it is legal under the Chinese constitution. So the Muslims are one of five legally permitted religious communities.
What are the
Buddhist,
other?
yeah, Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims, and then the next two you'll never guess: Protestants and Catholics, which are Christian, but they're divided into separate religious communities under Chinese law.
Mm, mm. Wow. So they got problems from the giddy up. So
Well,
now,
especially when there's any kind of political dimension to religious practice, like
always,
Tibetan.
always, you know,
Always,
you got and
always, yeah.
people want to save your soul, and people want to do something else. So
Right.
it's interesting in that I'm wondering what they're going to do with their constitution as people move to kind of preserve their rights under that constitution. But the Uyghur, I think everybody was surprised and was not surprised when they built these detention camps, re-education camps, or whatever it is you want to call them, and just started putting people in them. How do you do that?
Well, China has a belief that a lot of these ideas can be corrected through education. Some people call it thought reform or brainwashing.
Hmm.
So, one way to control any resistance on the part of the Uyghur to these grand plans and erasing their culture is to put them all in these camps. And up to 1 to 3 million of them, we think there's only 10 million of them. You're talking about 10 to 30% of the entire population being rounded up without their knowledge, without their permission. Children are separated from parents. Nobody knows where they are. Kids can't find their parents, they disappear. And they go through this period of thought reform and education. So I think it's appropriate to call them concentration camps or relocation centers, not unlike we did to the Japanese in World War II.
Yeah.
Harsh conditions. Um, but the government feels like they don't want to have any problems in this region. They are including other people they believe are a threat and need to be re-educated.
Such.
Uh, some Hui, some Kazakhs, not
Oh.
as many like Uyghurs. And so uh, then some of them who do refuse to cooperate are then put into the funneled into the prison system. And we're also afraid they're being used to engage in forced labor. And this is where the United States comes in terms of our own laws against using forced labor. So
Mhm.
recently, Congress, you may have noticed, has been passing law after law against China's treatment of the Uyghurs, particularly where we can leverage is with our investment and with our many companies that are engaged in China. And if we can show that forced labor is being used, then certain sanctions can be applied. We've also applied individual Magnitsky Act sanctions against certain Chinese individuals that we feel are responsible for this mistreatment of the Uyghurs. Now, many of us initially thought that this was going to be somewhat short-lived and felt that it was always going to be counterproductive. But China has dug in its feet, partly because I think of our horrible relationships with China right now. And China can afford to say no to the world. It's people want their products; they don't want their ideas.
Exactly.
And the world's governments are not standing up to China on this issue. There have been a lot of work. There's been a lot of measures and laws being passed in Europe, United States, Canada, Australia. Recently, has taken a very strong stand against China on this issue. But it's really, there's not a lot you can do when you're dealing with such an important economy to the
Okay.
world as China. And China knows that.
I was reading that various Muslim states, Muslim run states, are not standing up because of their economic agreements with China, which they feel will be jeopardized in some way. So it's almost as if they're saying, "Oh well, we can sacrifice the Uyghur," but getting money into Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Indonesia is more important than the Uyghur.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And governments are pretty weak-willed when it comes to dealing with China because they're
Yeah,
so beholden on China for its
yeah,
investment. But I think you also know, that on the Muslim street, there's quite a bit of anger and resentment about the treatment of Muslims in China. And at a
yeah,
popular level, it's hard to gauge how much power the popular level of the street has. But I think in terms of world opinion,
yeah,
China has really lost out on this issue in the Middle East and in the Muslim world. And
yeah,
it's losing a lot of friends. A lot of criticism has come out of Malaysia and Southeast Asia and the Philippines on its treatment of Muslims because they're Asian Muslims. When you look at the population of Muslims in China, it's 24 million. That's a large number when you compare the Middle Eastern states, which often have very small numbers of population.
right,
And China's Muslims are very important in China's relationship with the Middle East. So it could be shooting itself in the foot.
again.
And
Hmm.
in the long run, this policy is going to hurt China. Unfortunately, because I think if China treats its own population well, and we can work together, a lot of the world's problems can be addressed much more successfully if we work together, such as COVID-19, but more importantly, also climate change and space exploration, things like this that could do better if we work together. But as long as China keeps up this horrendous policy towards targeted communities like the Uyghur, it's really very hard to work with China on other issues. Right.
Yeah, well, it seems to be. Well, wait a minute. Before I ask my next question, one of our listeners has a question because I think it hit home when we heard about this movie Mulan, right? So, what's up with Mulan? I haven't seen it. I don't know if I'm going to watch it, but that became a well. Wait a minute, you're just going ahead as if everything is fine, and those who but Disney, makes this Chinese movie.
Well, today people say that a movie won't get made unless it has Chinese financing. And so
Yeah,
what we're seeing is the role of the dollar or the yuan, the renminbi,
mm,
and influencing the way history is portrayed. And of course, the
right,
story of Mulan is a great story of a woman warrior, to protect her people and her family. But unfortunately, with this kind of lens of
right,
Islamophobia and the
mm,
kind of suspicion of the other, the portrayal of the ethnic peoples in this film leaves much to be desired, as well
oh,
as editing out of certain key characters, whether perhaps there was a transgender individual in the
right,
film
right,
that may have been sidelined. I mean, these are editorial decisions the Chinese have made that Hollywood has gone along with.
huh?
And so when we think of this ability for Hollywood to send out a message, we begin to realize that it's not that simple. And it's uh, there was a lot of backlash and criticism in the West about this film, but much
Mm.
less so in China. They're more used to the portrayal of ethnic others in the way. We're not. We don't go along with that. We don't like that very much.
Well, I think
Um,
during the pandemic, it's also that it's another movie for children, and oh my goodness, Disney is wonderful, and Disney would never do anything wrong. And then if you come back and say Disney does a lot that is wrong,
yeah.
and ignores some gender issues, some racial issues, some, a whole bunch of stuff, then I say, oh my God, well, then what are my children going to watch?
Well, we can go back to a lot of our ancient folklore and see
Mm,
that underneath the surface, there's a lot of, stuff today that we would not approve of. A lot of, you
exactly.
know, stereotypical representation of others,
Yeah.
and uh, I think it's really healthy to call attention to these issues, and I've written about the representation of minorities, not just Uyghurs but other
Mhm.
communities in China, and I've tried to show that this kind of singing and dancing portrayal, and
Mhm.
everybody's happy and everybody's singing and performing, often for the majority. Now, we haven't talked much about the Han in China. That's the official nationality of the majority of the Chinese in China, known as the Han. Now, this nationality policy identifies 91% of China as one majority people, the Han. Now, you and I know that if you go out for Chinese food, you get Cantonese and Sichuanese and Mandarin, and okay, China is a very diverse place. But the
Mm.
government policy pretty much groups all that one large population together as a single nationality. And then there's 9% minorities. We're very diverse. But if
Mhm.
we look underneath the lid of that Han category, it's not unlike the critique we've had really recently in the United States about whiteness. How
Yeah.
is it that whites are a majority when there's a lot of diversity within whites?
Right.
And so there's also, discrimination against some European immigrant communities like Polish and Irish and Italians. We have that in our history. So it's in China, they mask a lot of its own internal diversity with this national category of the Han. And a
Mhm.
lot of that is being called into question today in China, not just its treatment of its minorities, but also how to recognize sub-Han identity, like the Cantonese, and their rise to power in southern China. That's very threatening to China.
Well, wait a minute, wait a minute. Tell me something about the Cantonese.
Well, of course, they're in the south when we think of Hong Kong. And in fact, most
Ah,
of
that's them.
American Chinese were of Cantonese background. So that's the river area of southern China. China is basically divided north and south by three rivers: the Pearl in the south, the Yangtze in the middle, sort of central northern plain of China, and then the Yellow River that carves through the north. And Chinese populations have often been divided along these geographic lines. Even genetics shows that the northern populations of Chinese genetically are very different than the southern Chinese. And you may have noticed that northerners tend to be larger and taller, more in terms of Central Asian looking, maybe lighter skin, larger noses, bigger. But in the South we have smaller, darker groups of people, maybe from southern migrations along the littoral coast through Southeast Asia, not unlike Southeast Asian populations. And that divide shows itself in China. But what you don't see is when you talk about the Han, this big diversity within the populations. We also have large populations of Sichuanese and Shanghainese and other groups like that. And all of them, they're different cultures, very different languages. If we look linguistically at the Chinese language family, we find nine different groups of linguistic families within Chinese. And the Cantonese fall under a group known as the Yue language family. Very distinct. And of course, the national language, Mandarin, was not utilized by the government to unify all of China really until the early part of the last century. Until that time, most people spoke their local native dialects, whether it was Cantonese or Sichuanese. So this kind of nationalist policy is a nationalist policy. The idea was to unite China as one nation to resist outside colonizers like the Japanese, like us, the United States. We were interested in carving up some territory in China, as well as the European powers. So China supported a nationalist movement, particularly aimed against the Japanese and also overthrowing the last empire of China, which was Manchu. So I think it's very interesting that China tends to be thought of as one country, one language, one people. But if you begin to look just under the surface a little bit or go out to eat, you'll find that there's enormous diversity underneath that veneer of monolithic language and culture. Now, I think this government is trying to push China along the route towards a more monocultural, monoethnic community, but I think the forces of globalization are preventing that. And China has a lot of work to do if it wants to try to mold a much more monocultural, monolithic community. And so I think this is a very important thing to realize as we deal with China. We're not dealing with a monolithic culture. We have one government. It's a very top down, centralized government. But underneath that, there's a lot of diversity, particularly along the north south lines, but also the urban rural lines as well as the interior of China, the northwestern regions of which we've been speaking, with the interior of China. Traditionally, very much divided, particularly in terms of the ecology of the regions as well as their histories.
Ah, this is Professor Ahmed with Professor Dru Gladney, and we're talking about Muslims and China. And we're also learning something about China on Critical Talk on Muslim Network TV. Thank you for continuing. I have no clue as to what happened to me, but I want you to just finish because this is a wonderful lesson for all of us.
Well, I was, just talking about diversity in China, and
Yeah.
I think for your audience, those who have traveled in China can attest the fact that it's not at all what you think it is, and the idea that all Chinese march to the same tune, they're all alike, that's really opposite to anyone's
Yeah.
experience visiting
Right,
China.
right. But I was remembering one class I had, and I showed a video clip, and they had folks doing Tai Chi. And one of my ex Army students freaked out. He said, "Oh my God, there's too many of them. And they're all doing the same thing." And I said, "Well, I kind of think it's just doing, some of them are just doing this one thing." And then I asked him, "Do you know how many people are in China?" They're not all doing the same thing, but there is that impression. And many in the Muslim community have been in an uproar. They see Muslim countries saying, "Oh no, we're not going to say anything." They see the populations being extremely upset, and I would think that. Um, Especially the Protestant and the Catholics are upset because they may be next to get
Yeah.
re-educated. Um, but I'm wondering, what do you think is going to happen? They've said no to everything. So, what do you think
Well,
is going to happen?
we anthropologists are not really great at predicting the future. We tend to spend our time analyzing the past and the present, but our political science and economist friends love to engage in kind of crystal ball gazing. I think with China, that's a really tough one because 30 years ago, when I first started going to China as a graduate student, my first visit was in 1981. I went to Hong Kong as a high school student in 1974 and was really fascinated. And that's kind of what got me into all this.
Yeah,
But 30 years ago, I would never have predicted that China would have risen as it has
yeah,
and become the second largest economy in the world. It's really
yeah.
extraordinary. So, as to where it's all going to go, I have my hope that China will be what the term is often used, a responsible stakeholder.
Mm,
Already, Chinese technology is really critical for trying to withstand global warming. And
right.
China's made some real advances in that area. And so far, we've been able to manage some of our differences in terms of uh, sovereignty issues in the Pacific and in South Asia.
Mm,
But some people predict there'll be, definitely will be a conflict between the United States and China, this so-called Thucydides trap, where a
yeah,
rising power will challenge a new power.
but there are a lot of people in China. There's not that many people in the United States. And granted, we have bombs, but so does China. And granted, we have this, and so does China. I don't think it would be an equal war on both sides. And the newspapers here would have us think that China is not a rising power. So what I'm going to do, because I got 9,000 questions, is grab some more of your time since you're not doing anything but baking in the sun, and ask you to come back for China part two, because it is an extremely important region. We know nothing, and you know a lot. This,
Well, I feel like scratching the surface, but the surface that I've scratched and spent most of my time is in areas where most people haven't traveled in China. Uh,
yeah,
I was very
So,
fortunate that I got permission to work with the Hui and study the Hui, and they're everywhere in China. So I traveled everywhere the Hui were, and that led
well,
me to
we're
the
going
entire.
to get your videos. We're going to figure something out with the videos because they're extremely important. And we're going to suck away some more of your knowledge. This is Professor Amin Dean, and I've been talking with Professor Dru Gladney, and it is true. We have only scratched the surface, and we will come back and scratch some more surface and dig a little deeper the next time I talk with him. Critical Talk thanks you. I thank you. I'm glad I'm reconnecting. And this is